Good evening to those of you in Asia. Good morning if you're in the Americas. Good afternoon to those of you in Europe or Africa or the Middle East. That famous tyrant geography is beaten back but not completely defeated in our hosting of this event online. My name is Peter Schoppert. I'm the director of NUS Press, the proud publisher of Innovation and China's Global Emergence, edited by Erik, Baark, Bert Hoffmann, and Jiwei Cheng. They join us now together with expert commentators who are on the cutting edge of interpreting the technology and innovation landscape in China to those of us outside it. We have two guests joining us, technical matters allowing. The first of those is Dan Wang. Dan has plays this role of interpreting technology developments in China in his analysis, writing and commentary, notably a recent piece in Foreign Affairs titled China's Sputnik Moment, How Washington Boosted Beijing's Quest for Tech Dominance. And interestingly enough, our other commentator, Scott Kennedy, if he's able to join us, he's working on a paper called Beyond Decoupling, Winning the High-Tech Competition Against China. So we'll have some interesting perspectives there. You know, our book is presented as helping to understand, you saw a little bit in the trailer just there, as helping to understand China's efforts to transform its economy, move up the value chain, anchor economic growth to productivity growth. Now, this is a rather standard framing in development economics, right? But these questions and these issues are now right in the middle of heightened US-China tension, and they become part of one of the most important international relations stories of our time. Can we restore the economist's perspective to these questions? Can we have that detachment? Do we want to? I look forward to a very exciting conversation and the opportunity to compare notes on this fast evolving situation and take some time also to take a book perspective on events. So here's a quick rundown of how we'll do this. We'll start with Bert Hoffmann representing the three editors of the book. Dan, then Scott will join to give us their commentary. The other editors will also join at that point and respond to the comments. And we'll move to a discussion, which we'll try to make as interactive as possible. At any point, actually, feel free to send us your questions in the YouTube or the Facebook comments, and we will bring those into the discussion. So just write them in the comments and then we'll get them to the group here in the call. But first, if you'll permit us, a short ceremony, the launch of the book. You know, we're a publisher, we like to celebrate these things a little bit, and I'm sure the authors and the many contributors to the book, well, they deserve a bit of a celebration as well. So ordinarily, when we publish a book, we might be shooting off fireworks or letting go a flock of doves, but, you know, it's a pandemic. So we'll do what we do in a pandemic, and that is cue a video. Cue video. There we are, we're launched. So thanks very much. The choice of the color of the curtain was not a political statement. Let me introduce the first of the book's editors to speak. Bert Hoffmann was the World Bank Country Director for China, 2014-2019. He's currently Director of the East Asia Institute at the National University of Singapore and Professor in Practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS. Over to you, Bert.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. It's a great joy to be here. A wonderful launch video. I hadn't seen it before, and it's quite an appropriate launch between all the red curtains. It's a great pleasure to present this book. I'm also very pleased to see that, though it's an academic book and it comes forth out of an academic conference, it really has tremendous relevance for the discussions of today, as you already indicated, Peter. And I hope it will have an influence also going forward for policymakers, but also setting some agenda in academia as well. It will definitely do so for the East Asian Institute. Clearly, China is becoming a technological leader, and in some areas it's already there. But I think this book also tries to put this in perspective. On the one hand, in the perspective of China's own growth theory, and to some extent to sort of put the issue on the table that, look, this is quite natural that China is moving now to a new phase, relying more on innovation, trying to rely more on productivity. But at the same time, and as you say, this phase comes at a time when there's increased tension with the United States, and perhaps increasingly with others, with partners of the United States as well. That's important for technology because China has remarkably well relied on international cooperation. That may surprise some of you, but some of the findings in the book say, look, China has been quite good in relating at the research stage with others, and the international cooperation is quite good. But in particularly in the product development stage, Xingyu Xing's contribution to the book documents that basically China didn't want to wait. China didn't go like Japan and Korea to first go through the phases of building the technology that would allow for product developments and then develop the products. No, they basically stitched together a whole range of technologies and then became innovative in telecoms, in phones, in other areas, and moved much faster as a consequence. The implication of that is, though, that also this disruption of technological cooperation led by the tech war, if you want, and the sanctions imposed by the Trump administration, but which seems to continue under the Biden administration, could potentially be very disruptive. And that's where Dan Wang, he won the prize in calling this China's Sputnik moment. And I hope that there will be a less tense period in the future where maybe Xi Jinping can thank Donald Trump for giving the inspiration of doubling down on what China calls their indigenous innovation, because that's what China is currently doing. It's similar to Mao Zedong in the early 70s, thanking the Prime Minister of Japan, saying, "Look, yes, you disrupted with the war, but without the Second World War, there wouldn't have been the People's Republic of China." So maybe that moment will come in the future. In particularly in areas of foundational technologies, China still relies a lot on foreign technologies, and of course the poster child for that is integrated circuits. China's realized that, and they want to invest a lot more under the 14th five-year plan, not just in R&D, but also in these foundational technologies, so more basic research investment. And they also trying to revamp their whole infrastructure for delivering research and development. So their national labs, they're experimenting with R&D special zones in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou. So they're really gearing up, and they have to some extent because they want to get away from that reliance. Second, what has really been the bone of contention, and the book goes into that, has been industrial policy, not so much R&D, but industrial policy. And clearly China has, over the past 10, 15 years, pursued industrial policy, and with maybe the peak industrial policy was made in China 2025, which became enormously controversial internationally. But as Carsten Holtz in this book argues, he says, look, yes, there are these policies. Well, first, they actually look quite a bit like the German version, the Industrie 4.0, so that maybe there wasn't that much new. But second, there's very little evidence that actually those policies get reflected in the investment patterns in China. So the question is maybe, well, does it really matter that much? And again, to put the poster child integrated circuits up front, China has been focusing on integrated circuits for the last 25 years, and yet they are still 2 generations behind the cutting edge, the cutting edge of integrated circuits as produced by the Taiwanese and Siemens, and as designed by the United States, and all put together by a Dutch machine of ASML. So that maybe also signifies, if you want, that the book is calling for somewhat more relaxed attitude to what China is doing, not interpreting it all as threatening, in part because it's not that effective. Even the R&D, if you look at the research in China, yes, they have an enormous amount of people working on it, and yes, the number of patents is going through the roof. But if you look at the forward citation of patents, for instance, which is a good measure of quality, it's only 7% of what the United States produces. So even though the gross volume may already be matching the United States, really in terms of quality, China is still a generation behind, in part because it's very recent that they started to invest in R&D, and they have a lot of catch up to do. On the international cooperation, look, the times are not that good. Gary Jefferson has a very interesting paper in the book where he talks about basically the inverted Kuznets curve of international cooperation. And he says, look, actually, currently the China and the US are at a stage where you would expect maybe less cooperation because China wants to catch up. The United States has a lot of the technology. And at some point, the leader doesn't want the runner-up to catch up. So you would see a decrease in any case. And that irrespective of the strategic and military implications of technology. But there might be a time, and that is the upside of the inverted U curve, there might be a time when China is further advanced in its technological capabilities, that cooperation actually becomes more natural again. And I definitely hope for that phase. In between that phase is not an easy phase, and as a matter of fact, some would say it's a bit of a dangerous phase, but I think the book tries to inform policymakers on both sides, on China side and on the international side, on sort of what should be feared, what can be feared, and what are more myths and presumptions that don't really find any basis in facts. To give one example of that, there's a good paper by Dan Prudhomme, who looks at the intellectual property treatment. It's been a big bone of contention. The U.S. has been pushing very hard on this point, and frankly, there's very little evidence that there's still a major abuse of intellectual property in China. As a matter of fact, Chinese inventors now demand a lot of intellectual property protection because it's worth money. And Adam Malik, in the same book, in his book, shows that the intellectual property assets becoming more and more valuable in China, and that also reflects a better protection of intellectual property. So again, I hope this book contribute to this debate, bring some facts on the table, give some strategic perspectives as well on cooperation, on potential friction points in those relationships, and hopefully it will help us come to a good ending. It clearly we can't deny the challenges, and the United States is still developing its China policy, and technology and innovation will undoubtedly be a big part of it. But I think we can also look at the upsides, and this book provides us with an opportunity to look at the upsides of possible international cooperation. Let me stop here and look forward to the questions and the debate.
Thanks very much, Bert. Wonderful. So the book gives us more nuance, but and more balance. But is that something that we're ready to hear? Why don't we hear now from Dan? Dan is in China now, and so we'll be able to give us sort of on the ground sense of how the debate is moving. Dan is a technology analyst at GovCall Dragonomics, contributor to Bloomberg Opinion. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Peter, and congratulations to Bert, Erik, and Jiwei for writing, I think, this a very useful compendium of what's going on with China and technology. And I'm very pleased to be offering some comments on what I see going on the ground in terms of everything that's happening here in Shanghai, one of the major technology zones in China. And I think the quick summary that I would offer with what has been going on with technology in China is that everything is going much more into overdrive. What we see is that the Beijing government, the central government, the rest of the party state is talking about technology very, very extensively from this point on. So the most striking event for me was at the end of 2020, when the Central Economic Work Conference designated science and technology as the most important economic work for the following year. As far as I can tell, science and technology has never been independently broken up in this forum, never mind take top spot, but I can go on and furnish example after example from people, including top leader Xi Jinping, to say that science and technology is the future. We must make breakthroughs. We must figure out choke point technologies, all because I think the Chinese leadership realizes that technology is one of these major grounds for competition with the United States. But just as I see that industrial policy in China is really going into overdrive, I think paradoxically it has become much less important to focus on what the Chinese government is doing and to focus much more on what the rest of the entrepreneurial firms are doing. And so to get into that, I think it is worth thinking through a little bit about the track record of Chinese industrial policy. What has been the overall record of successes and failures. And if you were to push me to give an overall assessment, I would say that at best, China's record on industrial policy has been a mixed success. Maybe it is far more accurate to say that it has mostly been a failure. There are certainly a lot of areas in which China is a technological leader today in terms of many segments of industrial technologies. I would point to things like solar panels, shipbuilding, steel, display panels, mobile telephony, high-speed rail, in which Chinese firms are pretty much at the cutting edge, and they are succeeding in pushing the technological frontier forward. But if you take a look at some of the much bigger ticket items, like, as Bert says, the poster child integrated circuits or semiconductors, chips, as well as aviation, which are much higher ticket technologies, higher ticket items, China's record here has been mostly pretty poor. In fact, Chinese firms are very barely just across the starting line when it comes to these pretty expensive, very complex technologies. What has been really the issue here with China's record? Well, I think that the main fundamental problem with Chinese industrial policy is that it has mostly been a government-led affair in which the government can rely on state ministries as well as state-owned enterprises to push the technological frontier forward. Now, sometimes that succeeds. It succeeded arguably in the cases of solar panels and shipbuilding and high-speed rail, in which you have provinces the size of European Union countries, each pushing forward and using procurement to try to really improve the technological process. But again, in much bigger ticket items, China's efforts, I think, have been not successful, mostly a failure. What has really changed over the last few years is that after President Trump entered the White House in 2017, his administration made a big effort to identify what it alleged were Chinese bad actors and designate them to various blacklists. And if you ask me who are China's technology leaders today, it would be names like Huawei, DJI, Tencent, ByteDance, SMIC. Xiaomi, and almost to a firm, all of these firms have faced some form of US sanctions, especially Huawei. Huawei is facing these extraordinary assertions of extraterritoriality by the US government, in which any use of a US technology could require a license if that technology is sold to Huawei. And the effects on Chinese firms have really been dramatic. It started first with ZTE, after ZTE was designated to the denied persons list managed by the US Department of Commerce. Its operations collapsed. After Fujian Jinhua was designated to the entity list, its operations collapsed. Huawei has received these two unique, highly complex right now. It's not doing very well. Huawei smartphone sales are fall to frankly some technologies like fish in addition to other parts. So Huawei is suffering a great deal. On the flip side, so we realize that a lot of the entrepreneurial firms haven't been keenly looking things sufficiency and rates have their hands forced the US government to try to remove domestic self-sufficiency. And what we see is a much more holistic effort in which the government today has a much better set of conflicts to improve this. So that's a great deal part of what's happening to China's technology effort. I think what the US government has done is it has placed Huawei in the position that NASA was in the 1960s, when it was the main buyer for integrated circuits, which were an unproven technology at the time. So Huawei today is forced to buy a huge amount of integrated circuits without really mind for price. They are mostly trying to buy integrated circuits on the basis of performance and not necessarily on cost, and therefore it has been driving forward a lot of China's technology progress. And I think the maybe the note to wrap up on is a reference to the book in the chapter by Professor Jiwei Cheng, which he identified that the share of value added in Chinese phones has increased pretty significantly over 10 years. The original iPhone in 2008 had around 2% of the value added generated in China. That was pretty much around the value of the labor involved in assembly. He redid the study in 2018 and found that in the iPhone 10, about 25% of the value added is generated in China, and that's on top of a much higher value phone. And so is this program of much more a whole of society effort to improve technology in China likely to work? Well, I think that in general, the prospects are not so bad, but it will take a very long time indeed. It's going to resemble much more of the iPhone story, in which there is steady incremental progress, but it takes a very long time. But fundamentally, I think I am pretty constructive that China will be able to figure out a lot of these technologies. In general, I think no large country has been able to monopolize any key technology over the longer run. If that could be the case, then Iraq would be the only place with agriculture, the Chinese would be the only people with gunpowder, and that's manifestly not the case. The Chinese firms only have to reinvent certain wheels. They don't need any new scientific theories to come up with ideas for products that exist today. I used to work in Silicon Valley. Really, the history of technology is a history of diffusion. The saying that we have is that knowledge travels at the speed of beer. Beer or coffee, pick your poison. People talk about these things, they think about them, and then more or less a lot of these things can't be replicated. And US policy can't really change the fact that China is an enormous market filled with daring entrepreneurs as well as a lot of technical talent. I think it will take a very long time. But this whole of society effort, triggered, I think, mostly by U.S. Sanctions, this very slapdash sanctions program, I think is pushing forward China's will as well as capabilities to do technology in a much greater way going forward. With that, let me wrap up and hand it back to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Dan. You broke up a little bit on our stream when you were addressing the Huawei situation in particular. I wonder if you could just come back to that now that you're in full flow and bandwidth that seems to be restored.
That's very curious. I broke up chatting about Huawei, but maybe at least ironic. I think the simple point I was trying to make about Huawei is that Huawei has faced a unique set of sanctions by the US government. The Department of Commerce wrote 2 unique rules for Huawei alone that deprives it of all technologies produced on the basis of US origin technologies, even if that's produced by foreign firms in Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Europe, even in China. And so it has faced the most severe set of restrictions, and it is the company most fighting the hardest to really try to recover its own capabilities. A lot of these Chinese firms now are working much more on the state's goals, not because they have become more loyal to Beijing, but because they're just trying to save their own operations and because their interests are very much to develop a lot of their own technology ecosystems. So that's a lot of the Huawei story.
Great, and we can return to that a little bit more in the discussion if you would like. We have with us 2 of the other editors of the book representing the contributors as well, Erik Baark and Jiwei Cheng. Perhaps, Erik, I'll ask you to go first. Erik is Professor Emeritus at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and a former visiting professor at the East Asian Institute here in NUS. Over to you, Erik.
Well, thanks, Peter. And thank you particularly for your support in publishing this book. Thank you, Bert and Dan, for very insightful comments. I want to say that for me, a key issue that the book may help us understand is whether or how China's innovation policies serve to make the country a global science and technology superpower, as some people have suggested. Personally, I don't think China is yet any science and technology superpower. But I also think that it's likely that sooner or later, China will reach a stage where it is at the frontiers of science and technology in many areas, and perhaps deserve the title of a global superpower. However, China has already reached a level of technological capabilities that make it an important global actor. And the US-China tensions that everybody talks about just serve to raise the image of a new superpower. I am more interested in what kind of a science and technology superpower China is likely to become. Will it become a superpower that prioritizes technologies for world domination and that seeks to control technology transfer to deny other nations access to essential technologies in the future? Or will China become the origin of new modes of innovation and international scientific breakthroughs that can assist other countries in solving global problems? For instance, climate change, poverty, health challenges. So I think that our book contributes to a better understanding of China's new innovative capabilities. But from my point of view, the jury is still out on the issue of where these capabilities will lead us. Thank you, Peter, and over to you.
Thanks, Erik. Perhaps we can talk a little bit further on about what are the gaps that need to be closed in order for China to take that superpower status, and whether the unique model of technology adoption by that came from being so important in the global value chain, what that says about the future moves that China would need to make. But let's come to that later. Jiwei, let's hear from you. Jiwei is with the East Asia Institute at NUS. He's a senior research fellow. Over to you, Jiwei.
Right, thanks, Peter, and thanks everybody to join the book launch. So what I'm doing now is I will firstly also talk about my perspective about this book, and then I will respond to some of Dan's comments. So as Peter said, so the book for some reason, the book actually is also built on the development economics perspective. So for example, some chapters, they are talking about the incentives, how to develop right incentives of innovation, including in intellectual property rights, in the chapter of Dan Proudhon, and also in Professor Fu Xiaolan's and her collaborators chapter. So we're talking they're talking about those incentives at the firm level about international collaboration. So also market structure important, because the big firms, they will have more profits, more capacity to develop and new technology, as Professor Jiwei Cheng mentioned, because the certain manufacturers such as Xiaomi and Oppo, they have market power, so they can do many things in marketing and also networking, and so they can do innovation alongside the global value chain. The other issue is factor mobility is important, because you need the more talented people, working for this technological innovation, like Professor Simon's chapter, and also Professor Simon's chapter talking about this talent flow, international talent flow to China. But I think the book also, beyond this development economics or innovation, economics and innovation literature, this book also contributes to China study. So we have many chapters talking about local agencies, including local government in Professor Carlton Ho's chapter. And also we have a chapter talking about local government and digital platforms in Professor Gaobai's chapter. So for the recent policy developments in the innovation areas in China, we also have a few chapters, including Professor Baark in the chapters on indigenous innovation, and Anton Markin's chapter about this made in China 2025. So I think in general, this book contributes to both innovation economics, development economics, and the China studies. So also comments from Dan, I think is very interesting. So I just quickly respond to a few of them. So Dan mentioned the China's innovative system is highly, basically driven by the entrepreneurs. So indeed, in the recently, people find out the national innovation system. If we believe there's one in China, there should be two dual innovative system. One is oriented from the state-owned enterprises, but the other is from private owned firms, because for both for different types of innovation system, you have different incentives. State-owned enterprises, they have incentives in career concerns alongside the cadres ladders. Private firms, they have an incentive on profitability and also market share. So what kind of innovation they are going to commit to will be very different. So that could be one particular interesting angle to interpret Dan's observation. The other interesting thing is that Dan said China's recently do have some change in industrial policy. So I just add a couple points. One is the how to allocate scientific fund in China recently it was claimed to be more competitive. So it no longer depends on which institutions you come from. Well, it depends on your merit, your track record on publications, as well as the track record on technological innovation. And also the other recent change I find also interesting is there's some new term called new types of research organizations. So those new types of research organizations, they are sort of extension from the university and the research institute, and also they try to engage in industrial related projects to be self-financed, to be to be market operatable in the markets. So that's that's something new in this innovative system. So Dan also mentioned China may try to follow Silicon Valley's example in future innovation. I think that could be one interesting observation. So regional innovative system could be quite important. So China has, as Professor Hofman also mentioned, there's a number of regional scientific centers in Shanghai, Beijing, Guangdong, Hefei. So those could facilitate the regional collaborations in innovation and technological developments. So along in Yangtze River Delta, there's something called G60 corridor, which I think it's a mirror version of Silicon Valley. Try to engage research universities, the industries alongside the corridor to collaborate with each other. So I think that's something we need to follow. Probably could be very interesting in the next few years. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jiwei, and thank you for highlighting this question of incentives and the different incentives at play in different aspects of the Chinese system. And of course, that's the problem with industrial policy. It distorts incentives. So I'm sure we can return to that subject. We do have another commentator who's just joined us. We're still getting him in the stream, but I think he's ready to go. And that's Scott Kennedy. Scott is Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Scott, I shared with the audience earlier that you're working on a paper called Beyond Decoupling, Winning the High-Tech Competition Against China, or so your website tells us. So over to you. We're really getting both a view of the book and the way that it takes the perspectives that Jiwei just talked about in a longer term, but also, of course, it's what's happening now, and how does it look in your case, from the U.S. perspective?
Sure. Well, thanks a lot for having me, and sorry for my technical challenges and arriving a little bit late to the program. But I want to congratulate the authors for working on this topic so diligently and putting together a first-rate book, which everybody who cares about China and industrial policy and innovation needs to read. Let me say a few general things about the issue as it intersects with the book from a perspective in Washington. There are a lot of perspectives in DC. I'm just going to give you mine, but that may sound a little bit different from the others, particularly given the climate between Washington and Beijing. But I've also been looking at technology and innovation in China for a few decades myself. I'm glad to be someone who works on this area with the co-authors for a long time, but now everybody is in our neighborhood paying attention to these issues, so they're more important than ever. So just a few points, and then really look forward to the rest of the conversation. So I think, as they say, innovation in China is a mixed picture. There has been a tremendous amount of success. China's economy has fundamentally changed over the last 4 decades. A lot of that due to intentional actions of state leaders at the national and local level, but also due to the entrepreneurial spirit, innovative efforts of entrepreneurs, scientists, engineers, and others. And oftentimes the state, whether it's at the central or local level, is catching up. Of course, industrial policy isn't just about giving credit to the leaders for identifying future technologies and mobilizing everyone to achieve them. Officials are also facilitating institutions and signals to have everybody work hard. And so I don't think that it's appropriate to say that China has innovated as much as it has, despite what central and local officials have done. Certainly, many times they've made bad choices, gotten in the way, inhibited wide-scale creativity. And, there's too much politics in China sometimes that scare folks from being creative enough to innovate. That is true, but that role of the state as a facilitator and handmaiden of innovation is certainly also true. So the state has put its foot on the gas and the brake at the same time. I think net probably it's accelerated innovation more than harmed it. If you had to give a balance sheet view, and which I think shows in the study that we're discussing today. I think a second point is that despite the fact that there has been a significant amount of innovation in China, and Chinese are showing leadership in a variety of technologies, I don't think we should overstate how far ahead China has come relative to others. It still ranks 14th or 15th in the Global Innovation Index that's issued by folks in Europe that everyone should look. We've tracked that data, and Chinese certainly have risen dramatically over the last 10 years in that index, which has 103 distinct metrics. But it's still mid-tier in the 15th. It's not first or second. And I think folks in Washington, D.C. in particular, sometimes just talk about China as an innovative superpower, like it's a peer across every technology. And there are some where the Chinese are peers, but not across the board. There are still real weaknesses. In the 1960s or 70s, I know Bert and others who've been with the World Bank and worked in international development for a long time will remember there was a conversation and a lot of writing about dependencia, or the dependency literature that explained one of the weaknesses of Latin American economies, and perhaps in Africa and elsewhere, is that there were limits on how much they could develop, not because of their own internal weaknesses, but because where they fit in the global economy, and the hierarchies that endured over a long period of time as a result of the way the international economy is structured. Now, our impression is that does not describe China vis-a-vis the West and advanced industrial economies, and that it's been industrial policy, the power of the state, the large Chinese market where they've been able to trade that market access for technology, the millions of engineers they graduate, that has let China move up the value-added chain, avoid the downsides that other developing countries have faced. I think we've gone too far and overly stated China's ability to get out of the positions that it's been in. And in fact, technologies and industries, they're not just supply chains, they're also hierarchies. And it's very, very difficult to escape those hierarchies and move up and move to the front of the pack. So if you look at automobiles, semiconductors, aerospace, and other technologies, certainly the Chinese have improved dramatically. Domestic value added has increased. There's some Chinese name brands, etc. But in most of these hierarchies, atop of them sit American and European, sometimes Japanese or Korean companies, with Chinese still in the middle. And it's just very, very difficult to get to the top because sometimes because of patents, sometimes just the first mover advantages of innovators, marketing arrangements, politics, and also just the difficulty of discovery. And Chinese innovation is very good at catching up, at applications. It's harder at that cutting edge discovery side of innovation. And so for a variety of reasons, the Chinese have run very fast and they've improved their position in many areas, but they're still not at the very head of the pack. And in most technologies. And so we talk about the Chinese running faster. Well, sometimes they run in circles. And sometimes they don't succeed, and sometimes there's significant failures. And in fact, even though you would say the US and Europe, from the perspective of policymakers here in Washington, isn't running fast enough, we do run more efficiently. We probably need to run faster. But nevertheless, I think the scoreboard needs to show that China has been reducing the gap between the US and other advanced innovators, but hasn't fully caught up or surpassed us, broadly speaking. So I think what that means in terms of policy implications, lastly, a final point is just for a Washington perspective, is that although we should be extremely impressed with what the Chinese have done the last few decades, it's been documented by the authors in many of their other publications, and in this one, we also need to, as they also show, be concerned about some of the trends that we see, and that Washington shouldn't get overly excited about switching towards an economic policy that encourages industrial policy that itself identifies national champions and picks winners, because oftentimes you end up picking losers. So we definitely need a more nimble, supportive policy environment in Washington and in local state governments around the US, but we shouldn't go too far, because the Chinese experience, as these authors show, provides signs of progress, but also warnings that we also should heed. So let me stop there.
Thank you very, very much, Scott. Fascinating, because you were also then raising the question of industrial policy in the US and the curious paradox of the US in attempting to compete with China, perhaps adopting some of the techniques that China is using. I think what I'm hearing, and this is partially, it comes from the perspective of the book, which was, written over some period of time, and today's events. There are two parts of the story. One is China's attempt to rise up the value chain, not fall into the middle economy trap, and so on. But then the second is, of course, that strategy has to change dramatically, strategically, in anticipation of and in reaction to moves to deny certain technologies to Chinese industries, and moves against companies like Huawei. So there are two things going on, right? There's a sort of what can China do? How is it doing it? How should we react to it? But of course, the game has changed completely now, because China has to respond to this changed environment. So I wondered if anyone wanted to kind of address that change of gears. Is that something only, do I have it right? I'm very much an amateur in observing these things. And what about the necessity of responding? How will that, how much do you see that happening in recent events over the last 18 months, 2 years? Bert, do you want to take that one?
Yeah.
Look at that side of things.
Yeah. Okay. I was wondering when I'm going to be on. I'm on. The technology is great.
Pretty fast.
It's great here. Well, look, on the first, I believe that China probably puts too much emphasis on technology and on industrial policy for catching up, for escaping the middle income trap. And it shows to some extent, and mind you, that's not just China, but if you look at the productivity statistics, you can paraphrase Solow. You say, well, you see technology everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And because China's total factor productivity has not been great at all over the past 15 years, and much less than in the big reform eras, the 80s and the 90s. So, and even the 2000s were better than the past decade. So technology does not equal catching up, does not equal productivity. And that's something that I think, so the answer is, well, you need supply side reforms, as the Chinese would say, but frankly, they have been lagging. But what I think is another point that has been lagging is the education system, where the translation of all this technology into new ideas, into better entrepreneurs, into lifting all the boats has not happened to the extent that it could have, because there's vast inequalities in the education system. Look, on the second, I think, let me repeat. I think that Dan coined the phrase. It's the Sputnik moment, and now it's I said before, this the mother of invention. Necessity is the mother of invention. So now China will double down, and they will put more pressure on it. And now in those areas where there's no alternative, they must come up with some, and in some areas it will still fail, but the pressure is now much higher. And there it is a bit, yes, past performance is a mixed bag, but I also think that because of this necessity, it is not necessarily a predictor of future performance. And part of the structure of China's technology innovation policies, because in the end the implementation is quite decentralized, that's messy and that's duplicative and probably not that efficient. But you probably see 15 groups now working on the 5 to 8 nanometer integrated circuit in China, and most of them will fail, but maybe one will not. It's the Manhattan Project, right? You don't just look at uranium, but you also look at heavy water, and you also look at plutonium at the same time, because you never know what's going to win. So I think we now see that way. That's a hypothesis. It remains to be seen. And indeed, the reaction, not just in the United States, same in Europe, where there's also now a lot more concern about industrial policy. I think the US, if they look at it, a number of very basic things, and they include infrastructure, they include access to education, will do very, very good things to the U.S. economy and to their innovativeness. Just like in China, if you look at back in China, why is there so much innovation? Why is there an Alibaba and a Tencent? Well, because the government put in the infrastructure, and they put in the internet and the transport. Before we started, we talked about the roads to the rural villages. They're simple things, but without it, you won't have any e-commerce in rural areas. Now you have. So simple stuff, where also the United States, where a large part of the United States, you don't have proper broadband access. No good reason to have that. So those things add to sort of very generic industrial policies of building the infrastructure that is a basis for further innovation, I think holds for the US as well as for China. So that's something you can learn from China. Yes, the picking winners, China hasn't been very good at it, but I also think China to some extent is backing away from it. They don't say, but the national champions, which was very much de rigueur sort of in the late 2000s, you hear less of it, and they try to make the promotion less distortive in that respect. They don't always succeed, because some of these state enterprises are huge, and they are huge power players, and sometimes they're the only ones. Like in trains, there's now only one train provider because of consolidation. So mistakes are being made. But there's also the one of the big instruments in China are these government-guided funds. And you can say, well, gee, that's a lot of subsidies, but actually it's a little bit of government money tied up with basically non-state money and managed by investment bankers for new technologies. That's a pretty neat way to go about. So learning from which instruments to use for that industrial policy is also continuously happening. I don't think China has it right, and have a lot to learn, but that's what R&D in the end is about. There's a lot of learning. if I mentioned the ASML machine, the lithography machine that prints these 5 nanometer chips, but that's 40 years of development that you see. So it's not the machine that was invented yesterday. It's 40 years.
Bert, thank you. Let's bring in everybody, because we're now going and we're raising some interesting points, and I've got a few people ready to comment. So Dan, Jiwei, and Erik, Scott, and Bert were all on screen. Scott, maybe I can ask you to respond to Bert's comment first, and then Erik will come to you to talk a little bit more about this digital economy and how important that is in going forward.
The two new challenges that the Chinese face, one is the challenge from DC, right, and the West, greater restrictions which require the Chinese, in their minds, to do more cutting edge research, and also not just be a part of the supply chain, but have many more components of it locally in politically safe places. The second is that they are now more at the cutting edge. They are innovating into the darkness of rather than catching up. Although there's still plenty of catch up to do, they are also trying to think about things which no one has had a solution for. That second one requires them to push them to try to benefit from globalization and transnational research and innovative networks, even more than they've done. Actually, during catch-up, having greater protection, playing hardball helps even more. But at this stage, actually, you need to be even more open than in the past. And the politics is pushing them in the opposite direction to be even more closed. But so I think actually the growing tensions between China and the rest of the world are going to hurt them even more, because you need not just access to patents, you need access to education and training. You need to have Chinese students in London, Tokyo, Singapore, Boston, Silicon Valley. You need workers there. And those restrictions are really going to hamper sort of a new era of innovation that's needed. The solution to this is for China to figure out a way to improve its relationship with the rest of the world, which is a political decision for the Chinese to be more cooperative, less ornery in terms of not just industrial policy, but how their political system operates, the norms that they're pushing internationally. On security, the security front, the Chinese need to rebuild trust with the rest of the world. Not because we want them to be cooperative and supplicant, but because it's in their own self-interest for the challenges that they have to be more innovative and raise productivity, to have a better relationship with the rest of the world. So really, it's up to China to figure out how they can adjust things at home and internationally to create a better ecosystem and environment for the type of innovation that they now need.
Thanks very much, Scott. Dan, I wonder how that sounds to you, and how that fits with the picture you painted for us earlier.
Sure. I'll make a quick comment. First, Bert, I think we're really escalating the metaphors here. I call this a Sputnik moment. You're calling this a Manhattan Project. Whatever is next. I think we're going to run out of the wartime economy metaphors. To make a quick comment on the restrictions, I think the U.S. restrictions really are such a big escalation that I wasn't really thinking about the previous trade war that the United States launched against Japan back in the 80s. As best as I can tell, that was focused mostly on tariff measures. There were no real export control measures that brought down major Japanese firms. And now the U.S. government is really forcing Chinese firms like Huawei to buy obviously inferior Chinese technologies. And Huawei, which is a notoriously difficult customer, is now all sweetness and light, asking for cooperation from smaller vendors. Really, I see that as a very big trigger that will improve a lot of the capabilities. So that's my brief comment.
Fantastic. Jiwei, do you want to speak about this point that Scott made, that China is now innovating on the frontier as well?
Yes, I just have a quick follow-up on the Scott's points. China, in some areas, you at the frontier of the innovation, firms need to take the risk projects. They should prepare to some project to be failed projects. So which also relate to incentive issues. So some types of firms, including state-owned enterprises, they are risk averse. So they may not really want to drop those projects, which may not be correct direction in innovation. So that's probably a future challenge for the research on the frontier. Thank you.
Erik.
Right. Well, I actually wanted to comment on the issue of productivity, because to some extent, I have a feeling that developing the infrastructure for a digital economy and getting a digital economy going really fast could solve some of China's productivity problems. If they manage to put a robot in every place and connect the whole system. So maybe I can say that if I should do the book again, maybe I'll have more on digital economy. We have Gaobai and Iru's contribution, which talks about the cloud computing systems in the promotion of this sector in Zhejiang and Shenzhen. And there's and maybe a future book should look much more at the digital economy. Jiwei and I have been working on a study of the industrial policy for a digital economy. And to some extent, I mean, we've definitely not finished, but to some extent, that brings out a whole new issue or a number of issues. For instance, what is the role of regulation? So Chinese leaders have just stepped in to regulate industrial policy in their digital sector, and I think they may be shooting themselves in the foot, or there may be other ways in which they could do a much better industrial policy. But I'm just mentioning this as if China manages to develop the infrastructure for a digital economy, they may solve some of the problems that they have with demography and so on. Thank you.
Certainly, the rhetoric suggests that they see the opportunity for leapfrogging, right, with digital and AI together. Bert, did you want to say something?
It's actually interesting. And Chor-Fan Lee from the Prime Minister's office here, he had a comment related to this, and I'd love to hear Dan's view on it. But let me first talk about me. This is really quite striking how there seems to be sort of a distinction that the leadership makes between useful technology and not so useful technology. And for some reason, the Tencents of the world and the Alibabas of the world that everybody outside China is in awe of seem to be in the wrong bucket. And so there is this emphasis on industrial technology and maintaining manufacturing industry as the backbone of the economy, which in a way goes in a different direction. And that's almost attacking those companies where we feel that China is leading. I wonder what Dan is thinking about this recent trend, without all the amidst all the noise that is around on these new regulations. Is that going to be the new trend? Is it something that the leadership feels is more important to redirect resources away from the Alibabas of the world?
I read
No.
last year, and my favorite is a November speech of something he gave, talking about a lot of different things that included dual circulation and urbanization. But one of the key lines in that November speech was that digitization is very important, but what we must never do is deindustrialize or lose the real economy. And I think what the Chinese leadership has done is that over the last year, it's seen that, my goodness, over COVID, people are using the internet, their mobile phones in all sorts of ways. And this has been a freewheeling sector for far too long without many regulations, frankly. And now it is time to regulate them, and it is now time to treat them as any other sector. Now, with respect to this distinction between industrial technologies and digital technologies, I think that when the Chinese leadership takes a look at companies like Tencent, which is mostly mobile gaming, which is this big communications platform that everyone uses, namely WeChat. When it takes a look at Ant Financial, what it sees are the creation of financial risk in terms of Ant Financial, or social problems in the case of Tencent. And it is far more important for China to master industrial technologies like aviation, as well as semiconductors, which employ a huge number of people, which are not so much about mature business platforms that are now in the stage of exercising market power and really doing a lot of rent collection. I find it personally dubious myself, the case that Tencent is a great innovator. To me, a lot of these consumer internet companies are much more engaged in innovating on business models, of which they're splendid at, and doing really exploiting network effects. But I think the Chinese leadership is much more keen to promote technologies in the real economy, as Xi keeps saying.
Didn't quite get into the question of the metaverse with that answer, but I hope that Chongfan Li, that does address your questions. Look, we're an hour and 10 minutes in. This is kind of where we wanted to end, but I feel that we're just, beginning to dig into some of the, that we could go on this conversation very usefully. I wonder if, but I think we'd better stick to our time limits. I wonder if I'd like to give everyone the chance to we just sum up, if you'd like, give a kind of final statement where you see this going, and then we'll wrap up with so discount code if you'd like to buy the book, and the link to where you can read the book, open access. So would anyone like to summarize? Maybe Erik, Jiwei will go in reverse order from your opening statements.
Well, as I said, I think we could probably do more in understanding China's emphasis on infrastructure in addition to industrial policy. I also noted there was a question from Minopar Qian about where China wants to export technology, and that has not been much researched. But the digital Belt and Road is definitely one area where China is moving forward to. Thanks.
Yeah. And Erik, let me say it's the publisher's dream that at the book launch, the editors start planning the next book. So thank you for that.
Well, in that case.
Jiwei, any last comments?
Yeah, I think the Professor Hofmann's point could be explored further. So education, higher education, and also the synergy between university, research institutes, enterprises could be could be one future directions to see how Chinese new types of innovative system developed in China. Thank you.
Fantastic. Scott, anything you'd like to leave us with?
Sure. Well, I think everybody needs to read the book, and there's obviously you can't answer every question in the book, and it's a changing landscape. I think an important question that we're all going to need to figure out is if this is a world that's more divided, where there's less transnational R&D, at least between the Pacific, two sides of the Pacific, is China able to build other types of stronger transnational R&D systems with colleagues in Southeast Asia, India, Europe? Can they avoid the type of restrictions that the U.S. is leading the charge on? And does that lead them to just be more politically closed up? Or might they be willing to take some risks? Innovation is about risks. Are they willing to take what they would consider some political risks to try and provide greater reassurance to governments and innovators elsewhere, so that they don't have to believe that they have to do all of this themselves? Because the harder you try, sometimes the less you succeed. And so I think they're in a difficult spot, and there's a lot to still be paying attention to because of new challenges that we're going to see in the coming years.
Yeah, thanks very much, Scott. Dan.
The future is bad and weird.
And I think and Bert, over to you.
Yeah, ×2. Well, just one reaction to Scott's remark, because I don't see, from a Chinese perspective, I don't see not a sort of a turnaround and a political turnaround, not just because it wouldn't be in their own interest and to maintain the international ties, but because Humpty Dumpty is broken and it's impossible to put it back together again. Because there may be another Trump. They can never trust the system anymore. That is now the problem in China. The trust is gone, and therefore they would need to rely more on domestic innovation, whether they like it or not. And they know that it's probably not going to be as good as before, but there's no alternative. Look, I owe lots of thanks first to Dan and Scott for joining us, and to Jiwei and Erik for doing really the heavy lifting on the editing, to all of the contributors to the book, and I'm glad to hear that it's extremely relevant and to have the book out there, and I hope many people will read it. And finally, a big thanks to NUS Press and Peter and his team for bringing this across the finishing line to have an Olympic metaphor in it. So thanks all very much.
Thank you, Bert. It's been a very great pleasure. Let us now share, after listening to that, you surely want to read the book if you haven't already. The book's available for purchase on websites in Europe, North America, and Asia, from Singapore. And if you're buying from Singapore, we have a 25% discount that you can get on our website using that code Innovation 25, and that'll work for the next month or so. In addition, we've also made the book available open access, and you can find that at the URL epress.nus.edu.sg/innovation in China. So it's all there. We do hope you'll buy the book because you'll need it by your side to check, but it's also available for you to read free online as well. So once again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the commentators for joining us. We really appreciate that. Thank you very much to the editors who did such a good job with this book. And good night, good morning, and good afternoon.